I'm here on the southern slopes of the area called Mount Zion today in Jerusalem, or as scholars refer to it, it's the western hill of Jerusalem. In the Second Temple period, in the time of Jesus, this would be the upper city of Jerusalem. The lower city would be in the city of David, which is right behind this building down at the valley. Today, there's a church standing here. It belongs to the French Roman Catholic order of the Assumptionists. And they built this church here. It's a modern church. And they call it St. Peter in Gallicantu, meaning St. Peter, that's, of course, our Peter from the Gospels, in Gallicantu of the rooster's crow. And the name refers to the event that, according to the French interpretation, happened here. During the Last Supper, which didn't take place here, okay, during the Last Supper, as you can see depicted here, Jesus stands before Peter, and he warns him that Peter is about to deny him 3 times. Look at the fingers of Jesus, 3, before the rooster crows. And you can actually see the rooster in the middle, in between Peter and Jesus. Immediately after, they go to Gethsemane. Jesus is arrested and he is taken for interrogation at the house of the high priest Caiaphas. Meanwhile, Peter follows Jesus from afar and he stands outside, waiting. During that time, Peter is identified 3 times by people who identify him as one of the disciples of Jesus. So they ask him, "Are you one of his followers?" And he says, "No, I'm not," 3 times. And then the rooster crows. Peter immediately realizes what happened. Obviously, he weeps, he repents, and eventually, according to the Gospels, he is forgiven. So the question we need to ask is there any basis to this tradition? Meaning, could it be that the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, was somewhere in this vicinity? To answer that question, I have to show you the archaeological excavations that were conducted here a couple of decades ago. Follow me. In the excavations conducted here at St. Peter in Gallicantu, a large neighborhood from the end of the Second Temple period was found. What we have here are massive houses, big walls, mikvaot, ritual baths, and many small items that are usually found in houses of Jews from the Second Temple period. What does it mean? Well, we know that the priests in the time of Jesus were the elite. They were the rich and wealthy people living in Jerusalem. So what we have here is a very wealthy neighborhood. Does that mean that priests lived here? It's possible. But, mind you, not only priests were rich during the Second Temple period. Maybe here, these were not priests. So it's not necessarily a neighborhood of priests here, or houses of priests. Okay, so that's not a good indication. But we do have here also mikvaot, ritual baths from the Second Temple period. We know that for priests, it was very important to keep themselves pure because they were working at the temple. So perhaps we'd like to say that because we have many mikvaot, many ritual baths here, it means that the neighborhood here is a neighborhood of priests. But that's, again, not necessarily the case, as there were other people who cared about being pure in the Second Temple period. Actually, the rabbis tell us many years later that during the Second Temple period, there was an eruption of purity. People were concerned about purity, regardless of whether they are priests or not. So ritual baths are not a proof, again, here. However, in the excavations, an inscription was found. There were several inscriptions found here, but this one is from the Second Temple period. It's an inscription in Hebrew characters and in Hebrew language mentioning korban, sacrifice. We do know that priests were responsible for the sacrifices in the temple. So maybe that's a good indication that priests indeed lived here. It's a possibility. It's even plausible, I'd say that. But let me remind you that we're on the western hill of Jerusalem, and excavations were conducted on that hill in other places too. For instance, in the Jewish quarter. And over there, a large neighborhood from the Second Temple period, from the 1st century AD, from the time of Jesus, was excavated. Again, thick walls, large buildings, mosaics on the floor, stone tools that keep themselves clear from impurity. All that indicates that over there at the top of the hill, probably priests were living. Moreover, a stone weight was found, and on it, in Hebrew letters from the Second Temple period, we have found the name Katros. Not only one such stone weight was found, but two were found, bearing the name of Katros. The Katros family is known to us from the later Hebrew sources. We're talking about a priestly family in Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. So also there in the Jewish quarter, we have indications of priestly families living, perhaps, not just here. So let's get back to the question. Could it be the site where the high priest Caiaphas lived? Yes, it is a possibility. It's possible he lived here, but it's also possible that he lived in what today we call the Jewish quarter. Can we resolve the question? Maybe we can. If you remember, Jesus was arrested at the Mount of Olives, at the foot of the Mount of Olives, in a place called Gethsemane, and then he's arrested, and he's taken to the house of Caiaphas, and after the interrogation, he was chained and sent over to Pontius Pilate. So maybe we should look for a prison, a place to keep the prisoners at the house of Caiaphas. Is there anything like that here in this excavation? Okay, it's a good question. Let me take you there. I'm now inside the church, at the basement of the church, and as you can see, the excavations we've seen outside continue inside the building. What do we see here? Well, you're looking at a deep hall down under, two entrances and a flight of steps. What is this? What is the meaning of that? Well, if you look at the signs on site, you will see it says that it was originally a tomb, and that in the Second Temple period it was converted into a dungeon, a prison, by lowering the ground. And if you look carefully inside, you can see a flight of steps going down into this prison. Now that sounds a bit convincing, but unfortunately, from an archaeological point of view, it isn't the case. What you're looking at here is a typical Jewish mikveh with two entrances, one for the impure going down and one for that who already dipped himself in the water and he's on the way to become pure and he's coming out. That's on the left. And obviously there's a flight of steps leading to the mikveh. Obviously, originally, the mikveh wasn't that deep. So what happened here was that in the Byzantine period, hundreds of years after Jesus, a church was built here, and they needed water. So what they did is they took the Jewish mikveh, the Jewish ritual bath, and they dug it down, lowering its floor to create a water reservoir. So what is it behind me? It's a Jewish mikveh from the Second Temple period converted into a water reservoir in the Byzantine era. We also have crosses on top, indicating that this was done in the Byzantine era. It means that we do not have a prison here. Now, does that undermine the theory that maybe Caiaphas' house was here? Not necessarily, you see, because I was actually misleading you a little bit. Go back to the New Testament and read about the interrogation of Jesus at the house of Caiaphas. It is not mentioned that Jesus was imprisoned in the house of Caiaphas or that there was a prison. Maybe he was imprisoned, he was chained, but then they took him to one of the rooms and waited until morning to take him to the house of the Roman governor, to Pontius Pilate. But it doesn't mention a structure, a feature of a prison at the house of Caiaphas, so we shouldn't be looking for it. Let's get back to what we said earlier. Is it possible that this was the house of Caiaphas? Perhaps. It's reasonable. Can we prove it? No. Is it an alternative? Yes, of course. Go up to the Jewish quarter and explore the houses, probably of priests, that were excavated there too. It's priestly neighborhoods all over this beautiful hill in the Second Temple period. Before we leave St. Peter and Gallicantu, let me show you just one last feature. You're looking down here and you see in front of you a stepped street, which is very interesting because if you try to reconstruct it, the steps are wide and narrow, and so on and so forth. It means it's, at least this part is from the Second Temple period. This is the typical way they build steps in the temple, in ritual baths, in tombs. So we have it here too. Now, this road leads from here, we are on the upper city of Jerusalem, down to the lower city, to the region of the city of David and the pool of Siloam, and the area of the Mount of Olives, at the foot of the Mount of Olives. What is the significance of this staircase, of this ascending street? Well, if indeed we are right in suggesting that this may have been the house of Caiaphas and the place of the pre-trial or the hearing of Jesus before he was sent to Pontius Pilate, then the topography here says it all. Jesus was arrested on the Mount of Olives to our east, and from there he should end up here at the house of Caiaphas. Which way they took him? This route here is a plausible route. Maybe when Jesus was brought to the house of Caiaphas, they brought him to the house through this street. At any rate, whether this is the house of Caiaphas or not, that's not the final phase of our story. From here, Jesus is taken now to the actual trial before Pontius Pilate. Let's go there. In the Tower of David Museum. The Tower of David Museum is in the Old City, actually. It's on its western side. It's not too far from Jaffa Gate, actually. So we're in a very central location. This building was actually an Ottoman Turkish building from the 1840s of the 19th century. So it's about 180 years old, the building above us. And once in the Turkish era, it used to be the prison and also a military camp, or in Turkish, Kishla. Turkish is the language that the Ottomans, the Turks, used. About 25 years ago or so, the Tower of David Museum received this building for a purpose of an expansion, and they began to dig down to explore what's underneath and make a better use of the space under the floor. The floor used to be very high, and as you can see now, it's quite low. And the surprise was huge when they struck remains of ancient times, beginning with the first temple period and ending in the medieval times, and in between, marvelous remains from the second temple period. And this is exactly what we see here. You're looking at a long piece of wall right behind me. This wall could have been a city wall. It is very thick, it is very robust, it's long. However, it can't be the city's wall, because the city's walls are immediately next to us, under the concrete wall over here. So this structure was actually something else. What could it be? So we opened the book of Josephus Flavius, describing Jerusalem in the Second Temple period in the 1st century AD. And there we find that roughly in this area, we should find the remains of the palace of King Herod, because this is roughly where it was built. Now, the palace of King Herod was built on a slope. We're not on a plateau, on a flat surface. There's a hill here going down to the west. In order to build it on a flat surface, they had to build retaining walls and then pour earth into it so as to support the palace on top. So we believe we have found the supporting structures, the supporting walls, the infrastructure of the palace of King Herod, which apparently was huge. It was so big at that time, according to Josephus, that there were 2 wings. You could actually throw a party in one of them, and on the other wing, people would be sleeping uninterrupted. So big it was. And in between, there were beautiful green gardens with water fountains and other decorations. It was an amazing place. Now, that was King Herod's palace, but it wasn't the only palace he had. He had many palaces all over the country. This was the palace in Jerusalem. So why did I bring you here? To show you a palace from the time of King Herod? Well, yes, but that's not the entire story. You see, I'd like to explore with you the question of the trial of Jesus in Jerusalem. According to the New Testament, Jesus was arrested at Gethsemane. He was then taken to a hearing, if you like, or a pre-trial at the palace of Caiaphas in Jerusalem. And then Caiaphas sends him over to the Roman governor, to Pontius Pilate, who was at Jerusalem at the time. Now, you must understand that the Roman governor did not reside in Jerusalem. The Roman governor usually resided in Caesarea. Caesarea was the center of command of the Roman Empire in Judea. But on holidays, the Roman governor would come to Jerusalem. Why? Because these are very tensed times, and a rebellion may begin instantly if something happens. So it was always good to keep an eye on what's happening in Jerusalem. And so Roman governors would come here during the main holidays, and of course Pontius Pilate did the same. Now, where did he reside when he was in Jerusalem? The New Testament generally speaks about a place called Praetorium, meaning the palace of the praetor, of the Roman governor. However, the location is not specified. Tradition, going back to the late Roman period and certainly the Byzantine era, states that the Praetorium, the place of the trial, would be in the Antonia fortress, a fortress which was built by King Herod and that was later used as a military camp that supervises the Temple Mount. So tradition has it that the Antonia fortress is where Pontius Pilate resides, and therefore this is the place where he tries Jesus. Therefore, till this day, the area, the path between the Antonia Fortress, which no longer exists, it was destroyed during the Great Revolt against the Romans, but the area is known to the north of the Temple Mount. The area, the street or the path today between the Antonia Fortress and the place of crucifixion is known as the Via Dolorosa, as the way of the cross, or literally the way of the suffering in Latin. This is the last way of Jesus carrying his cross on the way to the crucifixion. Is this tradition reliable? Well, it goes back many hundreds of years. Actually, it was established the way it is today about 800 years ago, perhaps even less. So we now need to ask the question again, only this time from a scholarly point of view, from a historical and archaeological perspective. Where would the Roman governor reside in Jerusalem when he comes during the holidays? Luckily, we get an answer, and that answer comes from an eyewitness, someone who lived in Jerusalem during the Roman occupation in the 1st century AD. And his name is Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian, whom we've mentioned several times in this program. Josephus tells us that in the year 66, the Roman governor, Florus, it's another governor, it's not our Pontius Pilate, it's 30 years later, Florus comes to Jerusalem and he resides in the city for a short while, and he also tries people and crucifies them. Where does he reside? Well, Josephus says nothing about the Antonia Fortress. He says that he resided in the palace of King Herod. If this indeed is an example to the general habit, to what usually the Roman governors would do, then the answer to our question is quite clear. The trial of Jesus must have taken place right here. Well, not in this level, of course, because remember, what we see here are the foundations of the palace of King Herod. The palace would have been, what, about 10 meters above our heads. That would be the floor level. Nevertheless, we're on the right spot. So to sum it up, we have two different approaches to the question of the whereabouts of the trial of Jesus. The traditional answer, the Antonia Fortress north of the Temple Mount. The scholarly answer today would be that this happened here. It's very plausible. Obviously, just like in any other case, we can't prove it. But I think it's highly plausible that this is indeed the case.